Welcome to the first of the Bedrock Lectures. My name is Kathleen Dean Moore. I'm a writer, a climate activist, and distinguished professor of environmental philosophy at Oregon State University. I've been asked with this first Bedrock Lecture to set the stage for the Permanent Peoples Tribunal on the human rights impacts of fracking. The Bedrock Lectures. Bedrock. Unbroken solid rock under the soil. It's a good name for a lecture series because bedrock is exactly what we are uncovering. On the one hand, we're talking about the oil extraction technique called fracking. Worldwide, 270,000 drilling rigs fracturing the bedrock under wildlands and farms to pump out the oil. At the same time, we're talking about the bedrock of globally shared moral values, international law that affirms the rights of humans and natural systems to a decent, ongoing life. We shouldn't be surprised that where these two kinds of bedrock grind together is a place of tectonic forces, straining, shattering the stony plates, determining the landscape in which future generations will live and die. So let's start with fracking and begin many years ago at precisely 10:03 p.m., 31,000 feet up into the starry sky, on a red-eye from Chicago to Portland. I was dozing there in 18A when the pilot's voice came over the intercom loud enough to make me jump. "We're flying over North Dakota," he announced. "If you look out the right side of the aircraft, you will see the famous Bakken shale oil fields where a big fracking operation is underway." I looked down into the darkness as directed. The night-blackened plain, horizon to horizon, was a grid of flames. I didn't know what to make of it. I had never seen anything like it, so I had no metaphor for this. I've seen a forest burst into flame, struck again and again and again by lightning. It wasn't like that. Way more carefully mapped, way more architectural. So what was it like? It was like some giant had stuck pins through the skin of the earth in a regular grid, horizon to horizon, east, west, north, south, at every point, piercing down to the earth's molten core and released the fires inside. If this is fracking, I thought then, what the hell is it? Hydraulic fracturing. It's a technology by the oil and gas industry to extract fossil fuels that are locked in solid rock. Workers pull tons of water from rivers or lakes or reservoirs, mix it with sand, herbicides, and trade secret chemicals, including hydrofluoric acid. They drill down maybe a mile or more. Maybe they turn then and drill horizontally. Under extreme pressure, they inject the liquid into the rocks down there. The pressure fractures the rock, and the oil and the gas seep out. The operators separate the oil from the gas. They sell the oil. They capture the methane gas, or they burn it off, as I was seeing from the airplane. The poisoned water that's left, they pump down the old wells. In the United States, 22% of fracking occurs on public or Indian land, with leases on a proposed 700,000 more acres soon to be on the auction block. Fracking has made the U.S. a net exporter of fossil fuels. It has made 41 U.S. citizens into billionaires. Consequently, fracking has become a major producer of the money that powers political campaigns, $326 million in campaign contributions and lobbying from the industry to the 113th Congress, a third of $1 billion, creating a lively market in legislators and industry regulators. In addition, fracking powers my Prius and my flight on that 747. It has created between 2 and 3 million jobs. The 270,000 wells fracked in the United States and the world have produced a glorious surge in profits for shareholders, including this university's foundation and my retirement portfolio. Fracking, the industry says, is the engine of the U.S. energy revolution. I do not doubt that this is true. Every flare sounds like a jet engine, I'm told. It smells like, well, can you imagine the smell of fire and brimstone? It tastes like, I don't know, but one woman reported that when she wiped the dust from a fracking operation from the hood of her car, the paint came with it. That roar, the sound of jet engines, is the sound of extractive capitalism. It has the smell of the go-get-'em economy, the ideology of endless growth, the brilliant shine of technological domination of the geophysical world. It has the sweet taste of unimaginable wealth and cheap energy. It is the hum and din of an economy surging toward, of course, a precipice. Fracking is fueling the ubiquity and the hegemony of fossil fuels, a major producer of greenhouse gases, which are changing forever the conditions under which life on Earth evolved. The conditions under which life on Earth prospered in this green and singing world. So let's talk about human rights. And for that, let's go to the window seat of a 737, descending in bright sunlight through 10,000 feet to the Grand Junction Airport. It looks as though the entire plateau below the 737 has broken out in chickenpox. The smooth brown face of the land is everywhere pocked with crusty discs, connected with narrow red lines. Here and there below the plain, sometimes besides rivers, are clusters of rectangular ponds bleeding red or yellow or green. What in God's name? I asked the man in the aisle seat. Fracking wells and waste ponds, he said, in God's name. The maze of fracking pads is spreading around the world, from red rock canyons to rainforests, from farmsteads to suburbs. The benefits are clearly detailed in hundreds of annual reports, dropping oil prices, increasing profits. The risks are becoming clearer and more fully documented by 900 peer-reviewed studies. Toxic surface water, contaminated groundwater, bulldozed landscapes, displaced families, lost farms, earthquakes, respiratory illness, rashes going on, water scarcity in some of the world's most arid regions, low birth weights for newborns, radioactive releases. The scientific understanding of fracking's effect increases, but so do efforts from Scott Pruitt's EPA to quash science that documents fracking's effect on human health and the environment. And so it goes. But we can set aside the scientific questions for the moment, because the essential question for us to deal with here is a moral and legal one. To what extent does the harm caused by hydraulic fracturing constitute a breach of internationally recognized human rights? In our lifetimes, we've become the beneficiaries of the collective moral wisdom of humankind gleaned from centuries of trial and terrible error. For the first time ever, all of humankind has reached a common global understanding of what is fair, what is worthy, what comes to each of us as a birthright. And correspondingly, we have a shared understanding of what is indecent and cruel, what a civilized society cannot tolerate. After World War II, in response to barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of humankind, representatives came together from around the world to encode this understanding into standards of international law. This was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. With this document, something new entered the world. The first document about moral value, adopted by an assembly of the entire human community. Imagine that. Imagine all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. A couple things should be noted. First, these are universal moral standards of human decency, so they supersede the laws of nations and transcend political boundaries. The international law judges the national laws against a global moral standard. This is important because many of the wrongs against human rights are perfectly legal by the laws of the land, committed under cover of domestically enacted statutes. In the United States, for example, the infamous Halliburton loophole essentially exempts fracking from the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and Superfund legislation. All perfectly legal under the law of the land. Under international law, maybe or maybe not. The second thing to notice is that the power of international human rights law is a moral power. When an international tribunal hears a human rights case, that is exactly what it is doing: hearing. A hearing is important. It makes a place to hear the stories of those who may be sworn to secrecy by a contract with industry, pressured into silence by neighbors, frightened into silence by industrial bullying, or battered into silence by poverty and racism, marginalized and ignored. And it makes a place to hear people speak for those who have no voice to speak. The silent ones, Pope Francis says, who scream up to heaven, plants and animals, children, future generations. So, good or bad, what are the human rights impacts of hydraulic fracturing? We don't know. That's what we need to figure out. To clarify the human rights impact of fracking and to affirm international standards of human rights obligations, we're assembling a session of the International Permanent Peoples Tribunal, the Tribunal on the Human Rights Impacts of Fracking and Climate Change. It will be hosted virtually and on the campus of Oregon State University, May 14th to 18th, 2018. Based in Rome, the Permanent Peoples Tribunal is a highly respected international forum that grew from the Russell-Sartre Tribunal of the 1960s, which investigated whether breaches of human rights norms occurred during the Vietnam War. Since then, it has conducted a series of high-profile hearings to determine whether human rights standards were abridged in Bhopal, Chernobyl, Myanmar, and other sites around the world. The Tribunal on Fracking will assemble a panel of jurists of international repute to hear arguments from attorneys with expertise in human rights law, who will call as witnesses not only scientists and professors, but indigenous and settler people whose lands are being fracked. In some ways, it's a research project, testing the hypothesis that human rights are at risk in fracking, and testing the hypothesis that power, raw corporate power, can be openly and freely discussed and held in check by standards of human decency. So it's a bitterly cold day in Montana. Oh my God, it was cold. Trust me on this. I've never been so cold in my life. Partly it was the temperature, but partly the wind. Nothing in this vast expanse of dead wheat fields stands against the wind. I've just left a session of the Society for Environmental Journalists, where I'd been listening to a representative of the American Petroleum Institute, a huge man, shaved head, black suit, immense feet. It was the time of the Deep Horizon oil gusher, and he was speaking in defense of an unfortunate event that occurred. As it happened, I found myself walking side by side with that very man as we left the conference. I said, starting a pleasant conversation. Do you have children? He stopped walking, leaned into my face, and warned me. Don't you ever, 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 ever underestimate the power of the fossil fuel industry. So that was that. I walked to my car alone, got in, punched on the radio. It was Arlo Guthrie. Good morning, America, how are you? I didn't know. I don't know how I am. In times of tectonic change, everything is shaken. When it comes to fracturing and human rights, there are so many essential questions waiting to be answered. In the oil industry, practices have grown seemingly without limits. But the jurisprudence of human rights is just beginning to grow. This whole discourse about human rights in a fossil fuel-driven world seems to me something new under the sun, newly born and just learning to walk. But that's what a tribunal is for, a giant step toward clarifying human rights doctrines. And just in time, there are huge questions that we need to figure out. The answers will shape the future. For example, do corporations, legal persons we're told, have human rights? Say, the right to make a profit. On the other hand, do corporations have human rights obligations that curtail their power? When they fail in those obligations, what is the remedy? 2. Do natural systems, the lives of the landscapes, have rights? That's a question, isn't it? If so, then by what right do men drive white trucks over a land of night lizards and wood rats under pinyon pines, down red rocks that once were beaches of an ancestral salt sea, with little regard for the living animate community that was already in that place? 3. What rights belong to future generations, the children of our children, the small ones of all species? How do those rights hold up to the rights of the living and the corporations that stalk the land, not quite living, not quite dead? Bertrand Russell said that philosophy is the art of asking questions. So you're going to have to take this outpouring of questions as an occupational hazard. So 4. What human rights do people have? If we have the right to life, liberty, and security of person, do we have the right to other liberties that are essential to the realization of all human rights? Fresh water, clean air, information, quiet, the right to be heard, the right to control ancestral land? 5. Under what circumstances do fracking and other unconventional oil and gas extraction techniques breach substantive and procedural human rights protected by international law as a matter of treaty or custom? And 6. Under what circumstances does fracking warrant the issuance of either provisional measures, a judgment enjoining further activity, remediation relief, or damages for causing environmental harm? Good questions. How badly we need answers. That's what this tribunal is for. On May 14th, people will gather in Corvallis, a small college town in an Oregon Valley, the ancestral land of the Kalapuya people. Others will tune in from around the world. It will be beautiful on campus then, pink rhododendrons piling over the brick buildings and lanes of star magnolias. Big flocks of evening grosbeaks will chitter in the elm trees, nipping the kernels from winged seeds. Students will be drinking lots of coffee in advance of final exams and graduation. And the Permanent Peoples Tribunal will assemble. Now, in the context of the power of government-backed corporations, we will test the power of stories from ordinary people who have felt the grip of fossil fuels. Do not ever, ever, ever underestimate the power of stories heard in a public forum, in the bright light of a truth-seeking panel, in the context of globally accepted moral standards. Aldo Leopold, author of the Sand County Almanac, the very sand that is now being mined for fracking, this Aldo Leopold said that nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. It evolves in the mind of a thinking community. In May, we will assemble that thinking community and participate in the evolution of a body of shared thought about what is decent and fair, honoring the human rights of people around the world. I welcome you to that feeling, thinking, listening community.